Allen Iverson, the player who won MVP in 2001, the one who single-handedly carried the Philadelphia 76 ERS to the NBA Finals, a cultural icon who forced the entire league to change the way it looked at identity, at hip-hop, at a black player from the streets, who had it all before the quiet but brutal events of life pulled him out of the very world he once dominated. No farewell game, no grand tribute ceremony. Allen Iverson left the NBA in confusion and haze, going from a central icon to someone without a team, without a role, without a clear place in a league that once revolved around him. In the years that followed, Iverson's public appearances grew more and more concerning. Tired, broken down, sometimes lost, like a man still searching for something he'd lost, but couldn't even name. The media no longer talked about him in terms of his legendary crossovers or his unrelenting fighting spirit, but with cold numbers laid against harsh reality. Over $150 million earned in his career, yet the money slowly ran dry. The people around him eating away at his finances and emotions. Long nights of partying to fill the void when the court was no longer there. Iverson once admitted he didn't know how to live when basketball ended, and that showed clearly in every moment he got caught up in alcohol, in isolation, in appearances that left fans unable to recognize the answer they once knew. The league moved forward with younger, more systematic, more perfectly packaged faces, while Allen Iverson was left behind like an inconvenient memory, an icon of an era the NBA was both grateful for and wanted to move past. There was no massive mansion foreclosed to tell the story of his downfall, but Iverson's collapse was laid bare in every time he disappeared from roster lists, every contract that never came, every moment he stood on the outside of the very league that once bore his name. The people who once cheered for him now looked back only with regret, and even Allen Iverson could no longer find himself in those old titles. Amid all of it, a wordless question hangs like a deep cut in the NBA's memory. How could someone who once carried the entire league on his shoulders, who was the soul of an era, who was called the answer for a whole generation, slide this far to end up in silence, confusion, and being left behind like this, when the lights went out and no one stepped forward to say, Allen Iverson still had a place here? The downfall of Allen Iverson didn't come from one single fall, not from one bad decision you could point a finger at, but from a long chain of choices, habits, relationships, and psychological voids, stretching over many years, quiet but corrosive, until nothing was left to hold on to. Throughout his NBA career, Allen Iverson earned more than $150 million US from salary, bonuses, and endorsement deals, a number that could have secured multiple generations. But money for him was never managed with planning or sobriety. It came too fast, too much, and left just as quickly, flowing through his hands into an oversized entourage system where friends, family, people calling themselves family, brothers, protectors surrounded him like a closed circle, consuming his assets, energy, and focus without anyone truly teaching him how to keep any of it. Iverson grew up in deprivation, so when he got money, he spent it as a way to make up for it, to keep people close, to prove he was no longer that abandoned poor kid, and that very thing made him an easy target. Poor management, lack of control, lack of people brave enough to say no, turned the huge fortune into a bottomless drain, where money was used to feed the image, the parties, the unconditional generosity, but never created long-term security. Alongside the financial bleed was the breakdown of family life. His marriage to Tawana Turner, his sweetheart since their teenage years, slowly fell apart under the pressure of fame, game schedules, constant separations, and unhealed conflicts. The divorce didn't just bring emotional pain, it dragged along heavy financial obligations, child support responsibilities, legal battles, and a sense of personal failure that Iverson never learned how to face head-on. Family, once a refuge, became part of the burden he carried as his career began to slip. When basketball was no longer the absolute center, alcohol and partying gradually took its place, becoming where Iverson escaped the emptiness, the feeling of not being needed anymore, not being celebrated anymore. Long nights without a court, without game pace, without adrenaline, left him lost in his own life, and alcohol became the easiest way to blur the pain he was never taught how to name. Meanwhile, the NBA kept changing, placing more and more emphasis on discipline, strategy, image management, and team roles, things Allen Iverson never truly fit into, not because he lacked talent, but because he was built to fight, not to adjust. When age and injuries made him no longer the irreplaceable star, Iverson couldn't adapt to a new role, couldn't accept coming off the bench, couldn't accept becoming a quiet leader, because his whole life had been shaped around being the center, the team carrier, the one never allowed to show weakness. That inability to adapt made teams gradually stay away from him, not because of his past, but because a future with him became too unpredictable. Contracts that never arrived, calls that went unanswered, promises that never materialized, and Allen Iverson was slowly pushed to the edges of the league he once was the soul of. There was never an official day the NBA turned its back on Iverson, but that long silence was the cruelest statement of all. His tragedy isn't that he lost money, lost a marriage, or lost his place in the league. It's that all of it happened at once, piling on top of each other, while he had no psychological tools to withstand it. No one taught Iverson how to live when the winning was over. No one prepared him for a path when the spotlight went dark, and he himself never learned how to stop and heal. So the downfall of Allen Iverson wasn't a sudden shock. It was the result of a long process where talent wasn't protected, emotions weren't processed, and the person inside was left alone too long until everything broke at once, leaving an icon who once carried the whole NBA on his shoulders, now standing in front of his own life, not knowing where to go next. To understand why Allen Iverson never truly learned how to slow down, never fully learned how to trust completely, and never got the chance to prepare for a life after the lights, you have to go back to where it all began. Hampton, Virginia, not as a peaceful East Coast town, but as a harsh survival environment where a child learned very early that the world wasn't safe. Iverson grew up in poor neighborhoods where police sirens, arguments, and violence weren't the exception, but the background rhythm of daily life, where kids weren't allowed to be carefree, and adults didn't have the luxury of being weak. In Hampton, poverty wasn't just a lack of money, it was a lack of choices, a lack of space to make mistakes, a lack of any feeling that tomorrow would be better than today. And in that context, Allen Iverson learned to observe, to react fast, to defend himself before getting hurt. Racism wasn't an abstract concept for that boy. It was in the way people looked, in suspicious glances, in daily interactions that made a black child understand he was always under judgment, always having to prove he deserved to exist. Those tensions weren't explained in words. No one sat him down to teach him how to handle emotions. They were just silently absorbed, building into a constant state of alertness, where not fully trusting anyone was normal and fighting back became instinct. The rules in Hampton weren't written down, but everyone understood. You had to be tough. You had to hit back. You couldn't show weakness, because one moment of vulnerability could make you a target. In that world, safety wasn't a default right. It was something you had to claim every day, with speed, with grit, with the ability to stand firm under pressure. And Allen Iverson, from very early on, learned to survive by those rules. His family couldn't create any buffer to shield him from the environment around him, and Hampton became Iverson's first school, a place with no blackboard, no curriculum, just raw lessons about having to protect yourself. It was in that space that Iverson formed a mindset that would follow him through his entire career, always ready to fight, always on guard, always feeling that if he didn't stand up, no one else would do it for him. Basketball, for the young Allen, wasn't just a game or natural talent, it was an escape, a legal way to release pent-up energy, to turn anger into motion, fear into speed. But even as basketball opened another door, what Hampton had deeply imprinted on that boy and never went away, it became the foundation for how Iverson saw the world, where every relationship had to be tested, where respect had to be earned and not given freely, and where holding on to your identity mattered more than pleasing others. There was no concept of safety in Allen Iverson's childhood, only brief moments of calm between threats, and that very absence of safety created a person who could never truly relax, even when standing at the very top. Hampton wasn't just the backdrop of his childhood. It was the place that planted the seeds of defensive instinct that would follow Iverson into the NBA, into locker rooms, into personal relationships, and ultimately into the post-fame years. Those poor, tension-filled streets didn't directly destroy Allen Iverson, but they taught him a way of living that was only suited for survival, not for healing. And when the NBA lights went out, those old lessons from Hampton were still there, rising up, filling the void basketball left behind, making his tragedy not a sudden accident, but the long-term consequence of a childhood that never knew what safety felt like. Amid the tense streets of Hampton, where violence and poverty shaped the daily rhythm of life, Allen Iverson's family unit wasn't a safe haven, but a fragile space where love existed alongside deprivation, instability, and voids that were never filled. Ann Iverson gave birth to her son when she was only 15 years old, at an age when many other kids were still fumbling through school and innocent dreams. She had to shoulder the responsibility of motherhood with no solid support to lean on. Allen's biological father was completely absent, never present in his childhood memories, no figure to look up to, no voice to rely on when the world became too heavy. That absence wasn't just the lack of a man in the house. It was the lack of a basic feeling that someone would stand in front to shield you when danger came crashing down. Anne loved her son. That was never in doubt. But her love was a survival kind of love, hurried, full of pressure, because she herself never had the chance to grow up fully. She had to work, to provide, to keep the family from falling apart. And in that process, Allen quietly learned a harsh lesson. Don't be a burden to others. Don't show weakness. Don't ask for protection when no one has the ability to give it. When Anne entered new relationships in search of stability, a man appeared in Allen's life as a stepfather, bringing fragile hope for a more complete family structure, but that hope quickly shattered when the man was arrested and sent to prison. Another male figure gone, another trust broken, and another layer of defense built up in the boy's soul. For Allen Iverson, men came and went, promises didn't last, and stability was only something that existed briefly before everything collapsed again. In that context, Anne was both the sole source of love and a living example of how cruel life could be. And though she tried to shield her son from the darkest corners of the world, her own struggles taught Allen that tears solved nothing. The boy learned to swallow his sadness, to stand tall when it hurt, to never believe someone would stay long enough to help him through. No one ever said outright that he wasn't allowed to be weak, but every circumstance around him sent the same message. Weakness was a luxury, a risk, something that could leave you behind. Ann Iverson, in her effort to keep the family alive, had no time or tools to heal her son's emotional wounds, and she herself carried unresolved hurts. Her love for Allen was real. It was deep, but it lacked stability, lacked guidance, lacked the safe boundaries a child needs to learn how to trust. Allen grew up in a family where everyone tried their hardest, but no one truly had the capacity to give more than what they had, and that created a bitter paradox. The boy was loved, but he wasn't healed. When crises happened, when basketball became the only way out, when he began to stand out and get noticed, The lessons from family still operated quietly inside. Take care of yourself, keep distance, stand alone. Those lessons helped Allen Iverson survive, helped him not collapse under street pressure, helped him play with unrelenting spirit, but they also planted the seeds for later struggles, when he didn't know how to lean on others, didn't know how to ask for help, and didn't know how to let go. The 15-year-old mother did everything she could within the limits of her circumstances and her age, but those very limits meant her love wasn't strong enough to become the medicine that healed. Allen Iverson stepped into the world with a heart nourished by affection, but armored in thick layers of vigilance, and from very early on, he learned that crying didn't make things better. Trusting too much only led to hurt, and to survive, sometimes you had to accept walking alone, even if that meant carrying loneliness for the rest of your life. When Allen Iverson reached 17, the defensive layers formed from family, and the streets hadn't even had time to settle before a crisis struck, not only breaking his youth, but etching a brutal lesson into his mind about power, prejudice, and solitude in the face of the system. The bowling alley incident in Hampton, Virginia, the moment his life veered in a different direction. That night began like many others for young people growing up in a tense environment, where small clashes could quickly escalate into conflict. And in that chaos, Iverson was arrested along with others after a brawl at a bowling center. What followed wasn't just a legal process. It was a chain of decisions heavy with prejudice. When a black teenager from the poor neighborhood was cast as the troublemaker, the danger, the one who needed to be punished as an example, Iverson faced serious charges, staring down a harsh sentence far beyond what many in similar situations received. And in a system where justice wasn't always blind, he quickly realized his past, his skin color, and his background had been brought into the courtroom right alongside him. The sentence felt like a potential end to all his dreams, and at 17, Allen Iverson had to walk into prison, sit behind bars for 4 months, cut off from family, from the court, from any sense of a clear future. For a teenager who hadn't even finished growing up, that experience wasn't just physical punishment, it was a direct blow to the psyche, where fear, rage, and betrayal blended into a heavy, wordless mass. In those 4 months, Iverson didn't see the world as fair. He saw it as a place where people like him had to take care of themselves, where the system didn't exist to protect, but to control and eliminate. When he was released after the sentence was reduced, and later pardoned, Iverson didn't walk out as someone exonerated. He walked out as a teenager carrying an invisible scar, the scar of being labeled criminal from so early on. The media didn't tell the story with empathy. It told it with a warning tone, turning him into an example of what society feared. And in many eyes, Allen Iverson was no longer a promising athletic talent. He was a risk, a big question mark about character and discipline. Scholarships were pulled back, doors that had cracked open slammed shut, and the dream of escaping Hampton through basketball seemed to vanish in an instant. Most importantly, the bowling alley case taught Iverson a lesson he never forgot. When everything falls apart, no one steps up to protect you except yourself. Family was powerless against the legal machine, the community couldn't fight the prejudice, and the system he'd been taught to trust became the force pushing him into darkness. From that moment, Iverson's defensive instinct was no longer a vague childhood reflex. It became a hard belief that he had to fight for every opportunity, every inch of space, every bit of respect himself. The anger built up during those months of confinement didn't explode into violence. It was compressed, transformed into a fierce drive, a determination to prove the system wrong about him. But along with that drive came a deep-rooted skepticism, a refusal to believe that rules and promises could protect him, and that later made Iverson always ready for confrontation, even when it wasn't necessary. The bowling alley incident didn't directly destroy Allen Iverson's career, but it reshaped who he was. Turning a boy who'd learned early not to cry into a young man who believed weakness equaled failure. When he returned to the court, when his talent drew attention again, people saw a small, quick, fearless player. But inside was someone who'd experienced isolation, tasted what it felt like for the entire system to turn its back, and learned to live with the thought that everything he achieved could be taken away at any moment. That's why Iverson played basketball as if every game was a trial, every crossover a defense argument, every fall a reminder that he couldn't afford to let his guard down. The bitter lesson from the bowling alley case never left him. It followed him to college, to the NBA, to locker rooms, and into personal relationships, keeping him always ready to react, always prepared for the worst-case scenario. And while the world looks back on that episode as a dark but past chapter, for Allen Iverson, it was the moment the system decided his fate, not with understanding, but with prejudice. And from then on, he entered every battle with the cold belief that if he didn't protect himself, no one else would. After the bowling alley incident, when Allen Iverson walked out of prison at 17 with a record already stained, the outside world didn't welcome him back like a misguided child. In need of rescue, it looked at him with wary eyes, as if all his talent had been erased by a single ink mark on paper. College doors that had once cracked open slammed shut, coaches turned away, recruiting programs withdrew in silence, and Iverson's future, which had seemed so tied to basketball, suddenly felt more fragile than ever. In that context, Georgetown emerged not as a reward, but as the only lifeline left, a thin thread between continuing to exist in the sports world and disappearing completely from the map. Coach John Thompson, a black man who understood exactly how the system worked and how it could crush kids from the streets, chose to stand up for Iverson not because he was certain of a future star, but because he believed that if no one reached out, the boy would be swallowed whole. That decision faced plenty of pushback from the media, from administrators, from people who said Georgetown was betting on an unnecessary risk, and Iverson understood that from the very first day he set foot on campus. He wasn't welcomed as a promising freshman, he was welcomed as a test case, a moral experiment, a name always accompanied by questions about whether he would reoffend, cause trouble, or even deserve this chance. The pressure on Iverson didn't just come from having to study, practice, and play in an environment completely different from Hampton's streets. It came from the feeling that he was being watched every step, that one small mistake would bring everything crashing down again, and this time, no one would step in to save him. On the court, Iverson didn't play like someone learning to adjust. He played like someone fighting to prove he belonged. Every drive a rebellion, every cut to the basket, a message that he was still here, that he hadn't been erased. His small frame collided non-stop with bigger, stronger opponents. But Iverson never backed down, because backing down meant admitting the doubters were right. Off the court, the whispers followed him relentlessly. The press didn't write about his defensive skills or his speed. They focused on his past, on the case, on the potential to cause trouble, and Iverson understood that at Georgetown, he didn't just have to play well, he had to play perfectly to be accepted. That doubt seeped into every practice, every game, turning every day into a constant test with no concept of safety or patience. John Thompson was both protector and strict overseer, setting clear boundaries, giving Iverson no room to slip, because he knew one stumble would let the whole system come back and say they were right from the start. In that environment, Iverson learned to play with absolute focus, allowing himself no distractions because basketball was no longer pure passion. It was the only means of survival. He ran, cut, defended, and attacked as if every game was the last, as if his future was decided in every possession. And that urgency turned his style into something fierce, uncompromising, completely different from his peers. Even after winning Big East Defensive Player of the Year 2 years in a row, Even after proving his worth on the court, Iverson was never fully trusted because in many eyes, he was still the kid who'd been to prison, still seen as a potential threat. Georgetown wasn't a place where Iverson was healed. It was a place where he was kept alive, where he was allowed to continue, but always under the condition that he couldn't fail, couldn't weaken, couldn't forget that this opportunity could vanish at any moment. It was during that period that Allen Iverson perfected the image of a player who played basketball, like he was fighting to survive, carrying controlled anger, unrelenting intensity, and the cold belief that the world only acknowledges you when you force it to. Georgetown saved Iverson from disappearing behind bars, but at the same time, it etched deep into him the feeling that he only existed as long as he kept proving his worth, a feeling that followed him through his entire NBA career, making him never play just for fun, but always play as if it was the only way to affirm that he deserved to be on the court and in this world. Stepping out of Georgetown with undeniable talent and a past no one could forget, Allen Iverson entered the NBA not as an ordinary rookie, but as a test case for the entire league, and being selected number 1 in the draft became an iconic yet deeply conflicted moment. The number 1 pick was supposed to be the ultimate affirmation, a promise of the future, but for Iverson, it felt more like being thrust straight into the center of a system that was never truly ready for the real him. The NBA welcomed Allen Iverson's talent, his speed, his fearlessness, his refusal to back down but fumbled, even felt uncomfortable with the identity he brought along. The cornrows, the tattoos covering his body, the hip-hop clothes, the street language, and the uncompromising attitude of Iverson stood in complete opposition to the image the NBA was trying to build at the time. Clean, marketable, controllable, easy to sell to an increasingly global market. Iverson wasn't deliberately rebellious. He simply refused to pretend to be someone else, and that refusal turned him into a problem that needed to be managed rather than a star who needed to be understood. The media quickly split. One side celebrated him as the embodiment of raw truth. The other criticized him as a bad image, a threat to kids, a symbol of indiscipline. Iverson's on-court handles made fans jump to their feet cheering, but what he wore, how he spoke, and how he lived made boardrooms uneasy. That tension escalated quickly when the NBA introduced the dress code rules, announced under the banner of professionalizing the image. But in the eyes of Iverson and many players of his generation, it was a clear message that who they were wasn't acceptable unless edited to fit. Iverson was turned into the symbol of this debate not because he started it, but because he refused to bow to it. He didn't cut his hair, didn't cover his tattoos, didn't change his tone to please people who'd never lived his life. Every time Iverson stepped onto the court, it wasn't just a basketball game. It was a quiet declaration that he wouldn't trade his identity for anyone else's comfort. But the price of that steadfastness was an increasingly clear isolation, as he was seen as a difficult-to-manage individual, a star unwilling to fit in by the system's definition. The criticism didn't stop at appearance. It spread to attitude, practice habits, sound bites taken out of context, and twisted, turning Iverson into a one-dimensional figure in the public eye. He became the name brought up every time the NBA talked about discipline issues, every time the media needed an example of the clash between talent and professionalism. Meanwhile, Iverson kept playing with the same survival spirit that had followed him from Hampton and Georgetown, charging into giants with his small frame, accepting the collisions, accepting the pain as if every game was a battle, to prove he deserved to exist in a space that never fully welcomed him. That contradiction created the first cultural tragedy of Iverson's career. He was loved by fans for his authenticity, but suspected by the system precisely because of that authenticity. The NBA needed him to expand cultural boundaries, but also wanted to control his impact, and Iverson was caught in the middle, both icon and problem. There was no single public confrontation, no one explosive moment, just a series of small clashes, new rules, repeated criticisms that slowly eroded the relationship between Iverson and the league. Allen Iverson's cultural tragedy began here not because he lacked talent or effort, but because he entered a system not ready to accept that a star could exist without being molded to fit a pre-existing template, and in that process, Iverson learned that even as the #1 pick, even when you brought excitement to the entire league, you could still be asked to change who you were, to be accepted, and refusing to do so would make the road ahead far lonelier. The peak of Allen Iverson didn't arrive like a complete fairy tale, but like a climb with bare hands, where every step forward left blood behind, and 2001 became the greatest and cruelest moment of his entire career. The MVP title that year wasn't just a personal award. It was the forced acknowledgement from the entire NBA of a person the system had never truly been comfortable accepting. Allen Iverson, with his small body in a league of giants, played a season that pushed beyond normal human biological limits, scoring, leading, defending, and carrying the entire Philadelphia 76 ERS on his shoulders as if there were no tomorrow. It wasn't a balanced team, not a star-studded collective, but a structure revolving around one single center. Iverson had to attack. Iverson had to set the pace. Iverson had to take the hits. Iverson had to get back up after every fall. Game after game, he charged into bodies dozens of pounds heavier, crashed to the hardwood, slid across, then popped back up, eyes still burning as if pain was just a necessary part of the job. There weren't many alternatives, no one to share the load, and the entire city of Philadelphia looked at him like their last warrior, placing every expectation, every hope, every years-long desperation, without a title on his shoulders. When Iverson's name was called as MVP, it was a victory for stubbornness, for an identity that refused to bow, for a player the entire league had once tried to reshape, but couldn't. But behind the lights, behind the applause, no one really stopped to ask how much he had paid for it. The playoffs that year were a near-suicidal physical journey, where Iverson played at a grueling pace, with extreme intensity, in a body constantly being worn down. Small injuries piled up, pains hidden, practices carried out in silence, where he wouldn't allow himself to complain, because complaining meant admitting he had limits. And then, the Philadelphia 76ers advanced to the NBA Finals, an achievement that seemed impossible with that roster facing the undefeated, in the playoffs Los Angeles Lakers, a powerhouse considered unbeatable. Game 1 of the finals became Iverson's immortal icon, 48 points, defeating the Lakers on their own floor, stepping over Tyronn Lue in a moment that declared he feared no one. But that moment, preserved in history as an image of pride, was also the clearest sign of the price Iverson was willing to pay. He played as if his body was a resource he could burn through, as if there was no need to save anything for tomorrow. The following games exposed a harsher reality when the Lakers adjusted, when the gap in personnel and physicality became too wide, and Iverson was forced to do more than any human could endure. He still scored, still fought, but every collision, every fall added another invisible crack to his body. No one asked if he could still take it because, in everyone's eyes, Iverson was the embodiment of resilience, of never backing down, and icons like that aren't allowed to show weakness. He finished the finals in defeat, but was celebrated as a hero, as a deserving MVP, as the soul of the season. Yet right in that moment of glory, the seeds of collapse were planted. Iverson's small body, already battered by years of disproportionate collisions, began accumulating irreversible damage, and his spirit, already accustomed to carrying everything alone, was pushed deeper into isolation. The 2001 peak didn't bring relief, didn't bring balance. It only reinforced a dangerous belief that he had to keep playing this way, keep sacrificing this way, if he wanted to be recognized. No one in the organization, no one in the system, stepped up to say this price was too high, that no human could carry an entire team forever. Allen Iverson walked out of the MVP season with the highest individual honor, with fans' reverence, but also with a weary body and a mind programmed to never stop. That was the greatest paradox of that peak. The most brilliant victory was also the moment Iverson went furthest from his ability to protect himself. He gave the NBA an unforgettable season, gave Philadelphia a rare dream, but in return, he laid the foundation for a future where pain, both physical and mental, would slowly come to collect its debt. The 2001 MVP wasn't just Allen Iverson's peak. It was proof that to reach glory in a system not built for you, he had to pay with his own blood, strength, and the silence of a man never asked how much more he could take. After the glorious 2001 season, when Allen Iverson stood at the peak where his entire career seemed to have converged to reach, what waited ahead wasn't stability or a paved road, but a very familiar emptiness for those who had fought alone too long. The Philadelphia 76ers of that year weren't built for longevity. They were patched together around Iverson as a makeshift structure, where everything worked only because of one central energy source, and when the season ended, the cracks began to show. The team slowly fell apart. Key pieces left. Personnel decisions were made that Iverson didn't control, and the collective that had gone to the finals with him no longer existed as a unified entity. Teammates went their separate ways, chasing contracts, new roles, stability that Philadelphia couldn't provide, while Iverson stayed still, the nominal center, but increasingly alone in reality. That sense of disconnection didn't hit all at once. It crept in through season after season, practice after practice, moment after moment, when Iverson looked around the locker room and realized the faces that once shared the trenches were gone. He still scored, still led, still played with the same fierce survival spirit, but the context had changed, and the burden on his shoulders didn't lighten, it grew heavier without the team bond to share it. Iverson began playing in a state that felt both familiar and alien. Familiar because he was used to carrying the team. Alien because he no longer felt he belonged to a collective with shared goals. Consecutive failures were no longer offset by the belief that tomorrow would be better, and the organization's patience gradually ran dry. The media started shifting tone from praising the warrior spirit to questioning his leadership, questioning whether Iverson could adapt to any role beyond scoring. In those questions, there was no room for empathy, only the expectation that he must keep carrying, keep sacrificing, keep proving his worth as he had before. But his body was no longer what it was in 2001. Accumulated injuries, lingering impacts from collisions, and his spirit began to tire from constantly standing on the front line. Even so, Iverson didn't allow himself to weaken, because his whole life had taught him that weakness couldn't be shown, that it could be exploited, dismissed. He kept playing as if there were no other choice, not allowing himself to step back and recover, not allowing himself to admit he needed help. In an environment increasingly prioritizing systems, strategy, and clear roles, Iverson became a paradox. Too important to ignore, too different to build around sustainably. His loneliness wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and prolonged, showing in losses where he still scored a lot, but not enough to save the team. In seasons that passed with goals growing blurrier, Iverson began to feel out of place, even in his own image. A man, once the league's icon, now questioned about whether he still fit the future. No one said outright that he was past his prime, but every decision, every move quietly sent that message. In that context, the 2001 peak gradually appeared as a false summit, a brilliant moment that didn't lead to stability, a victory that didn't create a foundation for tomorrow. Iverson stood on that peak and saw around him not a continuing path, but emptiness, where those who once stood beside him had left. where the organization was looking for other directions, and where he was still expected to hold himself together the same way. Not being allowed to weaken was the unspoken rule guiding every choice he made, because if he slowed down, if he admitted he couldn't keep carrying it alone, he would lose the one thing protecting him in this system, his irreplaceable role. But that very refusal to let himself weaken pushed Iverson further from any sense of belonging, turning him into a lone warrior on the court, fighting not just opponents, but time, his body, and the league's changes. Peaks aren't meant for the lonely, and Allen Iverson, though he reached it with everything he had, began to realize that nothing is more dangerous than standing at the top with no one truly beside you, no system patient enough to protect you, and no space to admit that even the toughest human can't carry everything forever. As the seasons passed after the 2001 peak, Allen Iverson didn't collapse right away, but the first signs of betrayal from his own body and mind began to appear like tiny cracks in a wall that had been forced to bear too much weight for too long. The injuries he once hid with sheer willpower no longer vanished. After a few days of rest, they lingered, recurred, dug deep into his knees, back, ankles, and even the shoulders that had absorbed thousands of disproportionate collisions. Iverson still took the floor, still played at high intensity, but his reflexes were no longer as sharp, his cuts no longer explosive, and every time he hit the hardwood, getting back up took one extra beat, even if it was just a fraction of a second. For a player who lived on speed and audacity, even that tiny delay was enough to create a quiet sense of panic, because Iverson knew full well that once his only real advantage started to wear down, everything would become far more dangerous. Alongside the physical decline came a growing psychological weight, not anymore from having to prove his worth to the system, but from the fear of losing the one thing he had ever truly controlled in his life. Basketball had once been the place where Iverson poured out all his anger, pain, and insecurity. But when basketball itself began to turn its back, he had no other anchor to hold on to. The criticism grew harsher, not about style or identity anymore, but about effectiveness, about whether he still deserved to be the focal point. In the locker room, Iverson started to feel like an outsider among a new generation, where tactical language, data, and standardized roles slowly replaced the survival spirit he had always represented. That sense of not belonging crept into every day, every night, keeping his mind in a constant state of tension and alertness, as if everything around him could collapse at any moment. Alcohol, which had once only been part of post-game celebrations, gradually became the tool Iverson used to quiet the noise in his head, to temporarily forget the fear that he was losing control. The nights grew longer than the days, the mornings brought more exhaustion than the day before, and that cycle played out quietly, not as loud as the scandals the media usually chases, but enough to slowly erode a man who was already worn out. He didn't drink to celebrate, he drank to numb the feeling that he was slipping away from the position that had protected him his entire life. Along with the alcohol came a change in how he reacted to the world, shifting from a warrior always ready to confront to someone more irritable, more prone to losing control not because he had become weaker, but because he was completely exhausted. Emotional outbursts happened more often. Impatient decisions, sharp words that widened the distance between him and the world around him. On the court, Iverson sometimes reacted a beat slower in situations that once were pure instinct, and each time it happened, he felt more clearly that time was no longer on his side. The scariest part wasn't that his body hurt, it was that his mind began to doubt itself, a state Iverson had never allowed to exist before. All his life, he had been taught that doubt was a luxury, that you had to charge forward no matter what. But now that doubt arrived without permission, slipping into the rare quiet moments, making him wonder whether he still had enough left to keep fighting the way he always had. No one really sat him down to ask how he was feeling, because the image of Iverson had been built around unbreakable resolve. And icons like that aren't supposed to need help. He kept taking the floor, kept playing, but each passing season took away another piece of his ability to protect himself, both physically and mentally. The injuries were no longer just medical issues, they became constant reminders that this body wasn't infinite, that the sacrifices had limits, even if Iverson had once believed he could overcome anything through sheer will. When the mind starts to betray you, when reflexes no longer match intent, when alcohol becomes a coping mechanism instead of joy, Allen Iverson entered the most dangerous phase of his career, not because he lost his talent, but because he was gradually losing the ability to control how he faced decline. This wasn't a public collapse. There was no single game that marked a clear ending, just a quiet process where each passing day brought a little more fatigue, a little more doubt, a little more unnamed damage. And through it all, Iverson still held to the unspoken vow that he wasn't allowed to weaken, wouldn't let himself stop to recover, because stopping would mean facing his greatest fear, that when he could no longer fight, he would have no value in a world that had never truly learned to love the human being inside him. When Allen Iverson left the NBA, there was no proper farewell ceremony, no real victory lap, no moment for him to put a period on his own journey, just a long silence where the calls slowly dried up, the promises were never kept, and the world kept spinning at its own pace, without waiting for the man who once stood at its center. Retirement came to Iverson not as an active choice, but as a reality that slowly became undeniable. He no longer had a clear place in a league that had changed too fast. No team to belong to, no locker room to walk into every day, no schedule to structure his time. Iverson stepped away from the court, carrying an enormous void in his identity. His entire life had been defined by fighting, by scoring, by getting back up after every fall. And when all of that disappeared, he didn't know who to call himself. The fame that once opened so many doors was no longer enough to bring him a new role, no longer enough to give meaning to mornings without a clear purpose. Iverson hadn't been prepared for life after the spotlight. No one had taught him how to transition from an on-court icon to an ordinary person with a slower rhythm. The invitations that came were sporadic, unstable, never enough to create a sense of belonging, and every time he appeared in public, he was pulled right back into the past, asked about old moments, old games, as if the current version of him didn't exist. That sense of disconnection grew even clearer when Iverson realized fame couldn't shield him from the real problems: waiting bills, family responsibilities, relationships that needed maintaining without the steady income he once had. Without the NBA, without big contracts, Iverson faced a world where everything had to be rebuilt from scratch, but he didn't have the tools to do it. The old habits, the old coping mechanisms no longer fit, but letting go of them meant facing the emptiness he had spent years trying to avoid. In the rare quiet moments, Iverson began to feel clearly that he had spent his whole life surviving in a state of tension, and when that tension vanished, he didn't know what to do with the silence. The outside world wasn't openly cruel, it was simply indifferent, and that indifference hurt more than any of the criticism that had followed him during his playing days. New stars emerged, new stories took over the airwaves, and Iverson gradually became a memory brought up only when nostalgia was needed, not a living figure in the present. With no clear role, no new definition of self, he floated between a glorious past and an undefined future. Efforts to find new meaning were scattered, directionless, because Iverson had never been taught how to plan a life beyond the court. He had once carried entire teams on his back, but now, even carrying himself through each day had become a challenge. Fame, once a shield, now became a double-edged sword, opening short-term opportunities while constantly reminding him of everything he had lost. In this period, Iverson didn't collapse in a loud, dramatic way. There was no major scandal to mark the end, just a slow wearing down of the spirit, a feeling that he was drifting in a world that no longer had room for his old version. Retirement wasn't just stopping playing. It was the moment Allen Iverson had to face the hardest question of his life, a question he had never had time to prepare for. When there's no more basketball, no more cheers, no more warrior role, then who am I? And while the world kept moving forward without looking back, Iverson stood still, trapped between radiant memories and a cold reality, realizing that fame couldn't save a man from having to find meaning for his own life. After leaving the court, when the last lights went out and the cheers only echoed in memory, Allen Iverson stepped into a phase of existence without a clear shape, gray years, where time moved slowly, and every day felt frighteningly similar to the last. Without a game schedule, without a structure forcing him to wake up with a specific purpose, Iverson faced the void basketball left behind, and in that void, alcohol became a familiar companion. At first, it was just a way to soften the silence, to fill the feeling of being unneeded. But gradually, alcohol seeped into daily life, becoming the tool he used to escape thoughts he had never learned to face. Nights stretched longer than days, mornings arrived with more exhaustion, and that cycle played out quietly, not as loud as the scandals the media usually chases, but enough to slowly wear down a man who was already drained. Family, once a fragile anchor, now also felt the pressure of that change. Relationships grew tense when Iverson was no longer the one providing financial stability or a sense of safety. Misunderstandings piled up, small arguments went unresolved, and the distance between him and his loved ones grew quietly. Iverson wasn't lacking in affection, on the contrary. He always loved his family in his own way, but he didn't know how to show vulnerability or ask for help when things spiraled beyond his control. That fracture didn't happen in one explosive moment. It happened in hundreds of small moments, where exhaustion made him withdraw, where alcohol became a shield to avoid conversation, and where those around him felt helpless because they couldn't reach the real person inside. During those gray years, Iverson began to look back at his life from a different angle, no longer caught up in the pace of competition. He had time to reflect on past decisions, missed opportunities, the people he had hurt, because he didn't know how to listen. Late apologies appeared sometimes in private conversations, sometimes only in his thoughts, but whatever form they took, they carried genuine regret. Iverson understood that he had lived too long in survival mode, where all energy went into staying upright, leaving no room for emotional care, and the price of that was now clearer than ever. But recognizing the problem didn't mean knowing how to fix it, and Iverson kept struggling between the desire to change and the deeply rooted habits. Those gray years weren't a complete collapse, they were a state of suspension, no longer falling freely, but not yet finding solid ground to stand on. He appeared occasionally in public at small events, brief meet and greets where the smile always came with tired eyes, and people began to see that the once unbreakable icon now carried the marks of a journey that had gone on too long. In silence, Iverson began clumsily to learn how to slow down, to listen more, even though it felt unfamiliar, and to admit that he couldn't keep existing on willpower alone. The late apologies, even if they couldn't change the past, became the first steps toward reconnecting with damaged relationships and, more importantly, toward facing himself. Allen Iverson's gray years weren't marked by dramatic moments or a public fall, but by the prolonged exhaustion of a man who had once lived too fast, too intensely, and now had to learn how to exist in the slow rhythm of everyday life. It was the period when he was no longer fighting opponents on the court, but fighting his own habits, fears, and memories, a quiet but no less brutal battle, where every passing day was a test to avoid slipping back to old ways, to hold on to the remaining connections, and to believe that even if it was late, healing was still possible if he had the courage to keep facing the truth. After the gray years passed in silence and exhaustion, Allen Iverson entered a phase that no longer carried the look of redemption or a dazzling rebirth, but simply a belated effort not to disappear from his own life. There was no dramatic wake-up moment, no powerful speech or overnight decision to change, just days following one another where Iverson began to admit, first to himself, that he had been wrong in many ways and that if he didn't change, he would continue to lose the few things he still had left. That admission didn't come from public pressure, but from the feeling of utter depletion when looking back at the road he had traveled, where he realized he had lived too long in defense mode, too accustomed to holding everything up with sheer will, to the point of forgetting that a human being also needs care and guidance. Iverson didn't try to rewrite history or justify his wrong choices. He simply began calling them by their right names, naming the avoidance of emotions, letting alcohol fill the voids, not being fully present for his family when they needed him most. That acknowledgement of mistakes didn't bring immediate relief, but it opened a new space where he could start living more slowly, even if very clumsily. In that space, his role as a father became the most important anchor, not because he wanted to become a perfect role model, but because he feared that if he kept sliding, he would lose the only chance left to hold on to some meaning for his life. Iverson began trying to show up more, to listen more, even though he wasn't used to talking about feelings or admitting weakness. Those efforts were sometimes awkward, sometimes not met with the response he hoped for, but they marked a shift in priorities as he realized that being a father isn't a series of glamorous moments, it's persistence in the small, everyday things. He couldn't fully make up for the lost years, but he could try not to repeat the same kind of absence in the present. At the same time, Iverson began learning how to accept the hardest lesson for a person who had spent his entire life in a posture of resistance. Accepting that his career was over, that he would no longer be celebrated the way he once was, that his body no longer allowed the old performances, and that the world wouldn't come back to give him another chance to fix things. That acceptance didn't come as resignation, but as a painful process where he had to face glorious memories without letting them swallow the present. Iverson learned to appear in public without needing to prove anything, to talk about the past without using it as an excuse to avoid responsibility, and to exist in the present without being haunted by who he used to be. Those belated efforts didn't turn Iverson into a brand new person. They only helped him hold on to the remaining version of himself, a version that was less aggressive, less guarded, but still carrying all the scars of the old journey. He didn't try to become a symbol of salvation or a perfect example for others, because he understood he had no right to that role, and he didn't have the energy for grand positions. What he was seeking now was simply conscious existence, waking up each day with goals small enough not to be crushed by pressure, staying in touch with family, with his children, with the relationships that remained. In that process, Iverson still stumbled, still had days when he slipped back into old habits, but the difference was that he no longer denied it, no longer fooled himself into thinking he was okay when he wasn't. Allen Iverson's effort not to disappear wasn't a beautiful or easily inspiring journey. It was a rough, slow process, where every step forward was small and easily shaken. But it was precisely in that smallness that Iverson began to find a different kind of strength. Not the strength to defeat opponents, but the strength to stay, to keep living, and to accept that sometimes not disappearing was already a big enough victory for a man who had lived too long in the shadow of himself. In the present, Allen Iverson no longer stands at the center of any court, no longer the focus of heated debates or enormous expectations. He exists in a quieter space where acceptance gradually replaces resistance. The NBA, after many years of looking back, has honored him not just as an MVP or a Hall of Famer, but as an inseparable part of the league's cultural history. A man who forced the system to confront its own limitations. Iverson appears at tribute events, formal ceremonies, where the past is recounted in a more respectful, less judgmental tone. And he stands there, no longer tensing up to prove anything, just listening and nodding, like a person who has been through too much to still care about being recognized or not. The cornrows, the tattoos, the style once seen as a problem, are now viewed as markers of a cultural shift, and Iverson has become an unofficial ambassador for a generation of players who changed the way the NBA looks at identity, diversity, and the right to be oneself. He is invited to speak, mentioned as an inspiration, as someone who paved the way, even though that path once cost him dearly. In this role, Iverson doesn't talk much about tactics or stats. He talks about daring to exist in a space that didn't welcome him, about refusing to bow to pressure to become someone else, and about the price of steadfastness when you don't have enough tools to protect yourself. But that recognition doesn't erase the wounds, both physical and mental, that still show in his slower steps, in his deeper voice, in the sometimes distant look in his eyes when he mentions the years gone by. Iverson today doesn't deny the pain. He just no longer lets it define his entire being. He lives with the memories like living with an old friend, inseparable, but not letting them control every decision. His public appearances carry a rare calm, not the calm of someone completely healed, but of someone who has accepted that some wounds will never disappear. Iverson knows he will always be the symbol of excessive sacrifice, of a small body forced to endure too many collisions, and of a mind that lived too long in a state of defense. He doesn't try to deny that, nor does he repaint the past to make it easier to hear. Instead, he appears as a living reminder that greatness often comes with loss, and that icons are also human, with limits and mistakes. In the rare conversations, Iverson talks about learning to live slowly, about prioritizing simple things, about making time for family and for himself, things he once considered secondary throughout his career. He no longer seeks extreme excitement, no longer needs to prove he can still fight, because his biggest battle now is keeping his life from slipping back into old cycles. The NBA may honor him, fans may love him, but Iverson understands that external recognition can't replace internal stability, and he is more careful with himself than ever. The wounds remain in a body that was worn down, in a mind stretched too long, and in relationships that couldn't be fully mended, but along with the wounds is a new calm, an ability to look straight at what happened without needing to run away. Allen Iverson today isn't the story of complete redemption, nor an unfinished tragedy. He is the image of a man who has reached the point where accepting himself, with everything lost and everything remaining, has become the most courageous act. He no longer tries to change the world or force the world to understand him. He simply stands there, in the quiet present, carrying an undeniable legacy, unerasable scars, and a fragile but real peace, enough to keep walking forward without needing to look back too much. Allen Iverson doesn't end his story with a complete victory. There's no triumphant comeback moment to close every wound, and there's no ending that leaves people relieved, believing everything will be okay. His life, just like most of the journey he's been on, stops in a halfway state where survival matters more than winning, and not betraying himself becomes the highest limit he can reach. Iverson doesn't win at life the way society usually defines it. He didn't keep a perfect career, didn't preserve his fortune, didn't build a smooth post-fame life like the model stories that get told. The losses are real, the mistakes are real, and the wounds, even if they've closed over, are still there as reminders of the price of a journey that was too brutal. But in everything he couldn't do, there's one thing Iverson never lost: his honesty with who he is. From Hampton to Georgetown, from the NBA to the post-fame years, he never pretended to be a more comfortable version to be accepted, never sold out his identity for safety. Even when that made his path lonelier, made the system turn its back, made opportunities disappear, Iverson still chose to stand tall in his own skin. That honesty didn't save him from pain, but it kept him from losing himself while surviving. He didn't return to the peak. There's no glorious rebirth chapter to erase the gray years. But he also didn't let himself vanish completely into silence. Allen Iverson survived not as a winner, but as a human being who went to the absolute edge of what he could endure and still stayed standing. That survival doesn't look heroic. It's full of exhaustion, full of regret, and sometimes very fragile. But it's real. And in that realness, Iverson found a different kind of value. One, not measured by titles or money. He didn't win at life, because life never played fair with him. But he also didn't let life force him to become someone else. What Iverson leaves behind isn't a guide to success. It's a cautionary story about the price of living in survival mode too long, about the danger of having no space to be weak, and about how talent, no matter how great, can't protect a person from burnout without care and understanding. But at the same time, his story is also an affirmation that identity has value, that holding onto yourself in a system that doesn't accept you is a courageous act, even if the price is very high. Allen Iverson isn't the man who won every battle he lost, more than people want to admit. Lost in private moments, lost in irreversible choices, lost in the race against time and his body. Yet he didn't betray the person inside, didn't deny his roots, didn't reject the journey that shaped him. And that's why, even without a happy ending, his story is still worth telling. The man who survived fame doesn't stand on a high podium, doesn't raise a final trophy. He stands in a lower, quieter place, but solid in his own way, carrying everything he lost and everything that remains. Iverson walked out of the lights with tired legs, but with a straight back, accepting that life doesn't need a perfect ending to still have meaning. He didn't win at life, but he also didn't let life win by forcing him to give up himself. And in a world full of polished stories made easy to consume, the raw, not fully redeemed existence of Allen Iverson becomes an uncomfortable but necessary reminder that sometimes surviving and staying true to yourself, even covered in scars, is a form of victory. Not everyone has the strength to achieve. The story of Allen Iverson is a very American tragedy, where the dream of rising from the bottom of society crashes head-on into the cruel limits of human beings and systems. The most heartbreaking part isn't that Iverson lost money, lost his peak, or lost his status in the NBA. It's that he had to pay, with his own body and mind, just to be recognized. From the violence-filled Hampton, a mother who gave birth at 15, an absent father, to the bowling alley case that branded him a criminal at 17, Iverson grew up in constant survival mode, where no one protected him except himself. When he entered the NBA, he kept fighting the same way, refusing to bow to the dress code, refusing to hide his identity, refusing to play to please the system. The 2001 MVP season is the clearest proof. Iverson carried the entire Sixers with his small body, worn down through every playoff game, every fall, while no one asked if he could still take it. And when the peak passed, the team fell apart. Teammates left. Injuries, alcohol, and disconnection slowly pulled him down until post-fame became nothing but gray years, fractured family, and belated apologies. But even in that tragedy, Iverson is still worthy of honor because he never betrayed himself. He didn't win at life. There's no complete happy ending, but he also didn't trade his identity for fake peace. The lesson for Americans today lies here. Talent and willpower aren't enough without a system that protects people. Society needs to learn how to care for its heroes after the lights go out. And every individual needs to understand that being allowed to be weak, being prepared for life after success, isn't failure. It's the condition to keep fame from crushing you. If the story of Allen Iverson has made you reflect on the real cost of fame and the power of living true to yourself, please subscribe to the channel to keep joining us on these raw and emotional journeys like this one. Thank you for listening all the way to the end, and see you in the next video. where we'll dive even deeper into the fates behind the spotlight.